Globally, the idea is that we should leave nobody behind under the targets of the UN. And clearly it means that the most marginalized and those communities and people that are marginalized and missing from the climate change debates and action and decisions are often the indigenous peoples of this world. And that's why the idea that climate change action and mitigation and adaptation and limits to the climate change pollution when they are being decided requires that indigenous peoples should be taken into account, which is not often the case. In fact, the history teaches us that the past decisions to try to address climate change, for example in India, some other parts of the world have often created great damages and losses to the indigenous communities and those committed peoples that are still on the ground living in their homelands, but in fact may suffer from bad decision making. So that's why the rights and the situation of indigenous peoples should be put front and center. This also goes to the idea of monitoring, in the idea that as long as indigenous communities are occupying their homelands and are living their so-called traditional lifestyles, they can provide us with a vast range of information how climate change happens. What does it mean? What are the implications globally? So in a way, indigenous peoples are a crucial but often a missing link in the climate change discussions. And lastly, the relationship between climate change policy, economics and decision making with indigenous peoples needs to be one of balance and dialogue. It can't be asymmetrical anymore. Asymmetrical means in this case that the other side has everything and the other side has nothing, which is the case today. So there is a lot of balancing to do, a balancing act, if we are trying to engage with the indigenous peoples in a meaningful way. Otherwise, many of these policies and actions will have very little meaning to the indigenous communities and world. Traditional knowledge, which is the term often referring to the way local and indigenous communities around the world conceptualize about their environment, traditions, ways of life and culture, can be a very crucial indicator of how things are changing. We are still living in a world where a lot of the monitoring of change happens using remote sensing on satellites or scientific expeditions. And at the same time we have a huge number of indigenous communities, many of which are engaged in the wilderness economies and subsistence economies in various forms around the world, which are making daily observations of how things are changing. So traditional knowledge can be linked with climate change in the sense that it may provide human sensors or observations of how things are, which can complement at its best the science-based view of impacts, observations and things that are changing. However, it's not a simple and straightforward solution to more monitoring. Traditional knowledge should be understood first and foremost as a practice or as a complex of belief, practice, occupancy and a whole holistic engagement with the local landscapes and homelands of the indigenous peoples. And then those messages that we record, if the community is willing and if all the rights are in place about that traditional knowledge, can possibly be shared and expand our understanding of climate change. But that in itself is not the knowledge. So the knowledge will be always embedded in the languages, in the life ways and in the cultures of the local communities. And we should not take the easy route to think that recordings, maps, photographs and other Western science-based tools of capturing aspects of that knowledge are the knowledge. That's a very important thing to realize. Secondly, traditional knowledge, if it's shared in a meaningful way with a particular indigenous community, can provide a very crucial baseline of change. Very often indigenous societies, local communities have been occupying and utilizing their homelands for centuries. In some cases, like with some of the Arctic indigenous groups, for thousands of years. And therefore their place names, their oral histories, their ways of possessing this knowledge can provide unparalleled view to change and provide us with a record and a baseline with which the current changes can be measured. And lastly, or thirdly, I would argue that traditional knowledge, again, if it's seen as a biocultural engagement with the local places, with the indigenous homelands, in an appropriate way, guided by the communities and the elders and the knowledge holders, is a pathway to wisdom. It's a set of, very often it's a blueprint for sustainability. Because you have to celebrate the survival of many of these indigenous communities, local communities to this day, despite the pressures and the damages that have happened. And it's a very strong testimony to the wisdom inherent in a lot of these traditional knowledge systems. It doesn't mean that we should glorify them or they are without their faults. They are also human systems, and there have been various problems with all of these human systems throughout our existence, but they are by far more sustainable and often able to provide very nuanced and crucial information and wisdom of how climate change happens, what are the impacts, and also very crucially, what should we be doing about them, about those impacts. So in a way, to summarize, traditional knowledge contains wisdom, day-to-day observations which are on the equal level as science due to the engagement that many indigenous peoples have with their ecosystems. And lastly, there's a realm that we should be listening to very carefully, which is the cosmological and deep wisdom of these human societies that may lead us out of the darkness where we are at the moment. Very often the indigenous and local communities globally are portrayed and discussed as appearing in the middle of nowhere. In fact, many of these indigenous societies possess and have possessed for centuries traditional land use forms, yearly cycles of harvesting, utilizing, fishing, hunting, berry picking, or whatever the traditional economy might be in a given case. This of course depends on the part of the planet we are discussing, in a fairly sustainable way. For example, here in the Arctic, the Sami people, with which we work quite much, for centuries have had their own land use system called the SIDA system of family and clan-based ecosystem management or governance as well. And it means that very large, in terms of scale, very large ecosystems and areas, even up to 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers, were utilized fairly sustainably by the Sami in those times when they were in charge of being able to govern those territories. If we bring this into the modern climate change context, land use is the number one issue that we should be looking at. Land use from the industrial and governmental side, from the modern economy, is often the number one destructive force that threatens the existence of indigenous home areas and homelands. for example, climate mitigation in the form of hydropower stations, is seen often as a green source of energy, when in fact it will flood, in most cases, indigenous and local community homelands. So there's a human cost to all that we do with the land. And that's why in this late hour in the game, we should be very careful in our decisions how we are using the lands, especially in infrastructure, industrial and large-scale activities. And if you turn this the other way, there's no better climate change adaptation and mitigation policy and action than leaving indigenous homelands to those peoples to take care of. Because at the end of the day, most of these societies globally are fully dependent on well-functioning ecosystems for their food security, traditional knowledge, sacred sites, history, culture, everything. So it's a very strong and holistic engagement with their places. And even a small intrusion into those homelands can wreck larger complex systems. If you create a hydro station or a mine, or if you clear cut last of the old growth forest, it will have many costs, including the capacity of the indigenous societies to meet and survive through the rapidly changing climate impacts, especially in the Arctic, where things are now very pronounced and very dramatic in terms of climate change. So land use in all of its different meanings is number one issue in trying to survive through climate change as a global society. And in that discussion, indigenous peoples with their traditional land uses are positioned to be very much as victims if things don't change quickly. First and foremost, we have to be very realistic at first. Climate change is here, and all of these things are industrial land use, the interests of companies and states regarding the Arctic and Arctic minerals and other natural resources are here. So all of this is on the table already, and we are far into that process as things are right now. So the things that we could try to do start with one realization, and that can be formulated in a way that we need a new relationship with the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and of European North if we are to try to see them survive through these changes. Then on practical level, there's a number of things we can try to do. One is to try to support with all different resources that we can the survival of, for example, Sami languages, worldview, traditional occupancies and land use to maintain things as they are. The second thing that we can decide on quite easily is again the land use, in the sense that if we don't impose transport corridors, mining, forestry and other industrial activities on these lands, and rather instead ratify and support the land and water rights of these communities, they have a more space and more scale to adapt and on their own terms to the changes underway. And lastly, in the Arctic there are profound things underway, of which the melting of the Arctic permafrost will have and already has global implications. We can't stop that process anymore, but what we can do is that in the Arctic and in this region we can try to preserve the last remaining natural ecosystems which are also carbon sinks, such as the wetlands, marsh mires, and those ecosystems that are characteristically Arctic, in the sense that they have inherent value, just like the indigenous cultures and communities of the area have inherent value for the world and for the diversity of the planet. They cannot be measured in any money or any material terms. The Skolt Sami, for example, have only 400 speakers of the language, or a few hundred speakers of the language, which means just like the Inari Sami and other Sami languages that they are severely under threat, but they are very detailed and deep in their connections with the ecosystems. And that's why these Sami languages, if we find meaningful partnerships and the Sami communities to engage with them, can provide with us crucial evidence of climate change and again deep connections with the landscapes to offer baselines and solutions of how things are done. Then there's a range of small things we can try to do, increase the solar panel in some reindeer camps in Siberia, provide for new models of sustainable transportation for reindeer communities and other things. But first and foremost, we need a new relationship with the Arctic peoples based on these kind of principles of deep and meaningful respect and cooperation, including rights, and then things will get better.